There is a regiment in the British Army that has never changed its uniform in over 200 years. They still wear the same towering black bearskin cap, the same scarlet tunic, the same stone-cold expression. And if you ask any one of them why they dress this way, why they stand so still, why they carry themselves as though the fate of the world rests on their shoulders, they will not answer you, because they were there, not personally, but in blood, in name, in the memory that lives inside every button on their chest. On the 18th of June, 1815, somewhere in the muddy fields south of Brussels, a battle was fought that would decide the future of Europe. Hundreds of thousands of men, cannons shaking the ground, horses screaming, officers dying with their swords still in their hands. And in the middle of all of it, standing where no man should have been able to stand, were the men who would be named after that day forever. This is the true story of the Grenadier Guards, who they were before Waterloo, what they did during it, and why, even today, when they march past Buckingham Palace in perfect silence, the whole world stops and watches. Because some names are not given, they are earned, in smoke, in fire, in blood that soaked into Belgian soil and never fully washed away, long before the cannons roared at Waterloo, long before the smoke of that terrible June morning curled into the Belgian sky. There was a king who was afraid, not of one man, not of one army, but of an idea. And ideas, as every ruler eventually discovers, are far harder to kill than soldiers. The year was 1656. England was not yet England in the way people would later come to understand it. The monarchy had been shattered. King Charles had been executed in public, in front of a crowd that stood in stunned, horrified silence as his head was separated from his body on a cold January morning in 1649. Oliver Cromwell, the man who had engineered that execution, had ruled the country with an iron fist for years. But Cromwell was dead now too, buried and already becoming a symbol of something that England was beginning to reject. His son Richard had tried to hold power and failed within months. The whole structure of the Republic was collapsing from the inside, and somewhere across the Channel, in the courts of Europe, a young man with dark eyes and an uneasy sense of destiny was waiting. Charles II had spent years in exile. He had watched his father die. He had fled England in disguise, hiding in oak trees, sleeping in barns, moving through the countryside like a fugitive while the men who had killed his father searched for him. He had lived on the charity of foreign courts, eaten meals he had not paid for, slept in rooms that were not his. And through all of it, he had carried one single belief inside him like a burning coal that he would return, that the throne was his, that England would eventually call him back. It did. In 1660, Charles II sailed back across the Channel and rode into London to scenes of celebration that bordered on hysteria. People lined the streets. Church bells rang for hours. Women threw flowers. Men wept. The restoration of the monarchy felt, to many people, like the restoration of order itself, like God had finally corrected a terrible mistake. But Charles was not a foolish man. He understood that what had happened to his father could happen to him. He understood that a king without loyal soldiers was a king in name only. And so, within years of returning to his throne, he began to build something. A personal bodyguard, a regiment of soldiers whose only purpose, whose only loyalty, whose only reason for existing was to stand between the king and whatever might come for him. These soldiers were not just any men pulled from the streets. They were chosen. They were trained. They were given uniforms of scarlet wool that made them visible on any battlefield, because visibility was part of the point. A king's guard was supposed to be seen. It was supposed to say, without a single word, that approaching the king meant going through us first, and going through us is something no sane man would want to attempt. In those early years, the regiment called itself the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards. The name was simple and military and said exactly what it needed to say. They were infantry. They were the first. They guarded on foot. There was no poetry in it yet. The poetry would come later, dipped in blood and written in gunpowder on a field in Belgium 160 years into the future. But understanding what they became requires understanding what they were trained to be from the very beginning. These were not ceremonial soldiers. The idea that the king's guards were simply decorative, simply tall men in fancy hats standing outside palaces, that idea would have been insulting to the men who built this regiment. They were fighters, real fighters. Soldiers who were expected to march, to dig trenches, to sleep in mud, to carry heavy equipment across long distances in bad weather. And then, at the end of all that hardship, to stand in formation under cannon fire and not run. The discipline required for that last part, the not running, is something that most people today cannot fully imagine. Standing in a line while cannonballs cut through the men beside you, while the noise of artillery literally shakes your internal organs, while smoke makes it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction, while horses charge toward you with riders screaming and blades raised. Standing in that situation and not running requires a specific kind of training that goes beyond physical fitness. It requires a complete restructuring of a man's instincts. It requires drilling the same movement so many thousands of times that when panic comes, the body does not listen to it. The body just moves. Load, aim, fire. Step forward. Hold the line. Load, aim, fire again. This was what the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards was built to do, and in the decades after their formation, they had plenty of opportunity to do it. England in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was almost constantly at war with someone. The French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Jacobites, those who supported the exiled Stuart line and wanted to overthrow the Protestant succession. The regiment fought in Flanders. It fought in Ireland. It fought at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, where William III defeated the forces of James II in a confrontation that still echoes in Irish history today. It fought in the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict so complicated in its causes and so brutal in its execution that historians still argue about what it actually settled. Through all of these campaigns, the regiment built something that no training manual can manufacture and no officer can simply order into existence. It built a reputation, and reputation in a military context is not about fame or celebrity. It is about something simpler and more fundamental. It is about whether, when the moment comes, the other men around you believe that you will hold, whether the soldiers on your flanks can trust that you will not break, whether the enemy, looking at you across the field, feels something in the pit of their stomach that makes them hesitate before they charge. The regiment earned that reputation slowly, over many decades, through the simple accumulation of moments in which they did what they were supposed to do when it would have been very easy, and perhaps very understandable, to do something else. By the early 18th century, the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards had become one of the most respected military units in the British Army. Not the largest, not the flashiest, but respected. When commanders needed a position held, when they needed a line to stand firm under pressure that would break lesser units, they sent the guards. The guards would hold. That was simply what they did. The 18th century brought more wars, more campaigns, more chances to add to that accumulated weight of experience. The War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, which was in many ways the first truly global conflict in human history, fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, India, and the Caribbean. The American Revolutionary War, which the British eventually lost, a fact that caused considerable national soul-searching about the nature of military doctrine, colonial governance, and what exactly it meant to be an empire. Through all of these conflicts, the Guards continued to serve. They continued to train. They continued to produce the kind of officers and soldiers who understood, at a level that had become almost biological, what it meant to hold the line. The regiment was present at some of the defining moments of the 18th century, accumulating the kind of institutional memory that cannot be transmitted through written orders, but only through the slow transfer of experience from older soldiers to newer ones, through the stories told around campfires and in barracks, through the particular way a veteran sergeant corrected a young soldier's posture, not because the regulation demanded it, but because he had seen what happened when a man's posture broke at the wrong moment. And then in 1789, everything changed. Not in England, in France. The French Revolution began as an economic crisis and became something that no one, not the revolutionaries themselves, not the kings of Europe who watched in horror, not the philosophers who had spent decades writing about liberty and equality, had quite anticipated. It became a force, a momentum, a demonstration that the old order of Europe, the arrangement of kings and aristocrats and peasants that had structured human society for centuries, was not actually permanent. That it could be broken, that it could be replaced with something else, something different, something that the world had never quite seen before. The revolution consumed France in fire and blood. The king and queen were executed. The aristocracy was destroyed. A new republic rose and then promptly began killing its own members in a period so violent and so arbitrary that it became known simply as the Terror. And then, out of the chaos, out of the violence and the confusion and the exhausted hunger for order, emerged a man. Napoleon Bonaparte was a Corsican-born artillery officer of no particular family background who possessed, in combination, three qualities so rare as to be almost supernatural when found together. He was a military genius of the first order, capable of understanding a battlefield the way a chess grandmaster understands a board, seeing not just what was in front of him, but what would be possible 3 moves into the future. He was a political genius, capable of managing the enormous, fractious, competing interests of a revolutionary republic, and then an empire with a skill that made even his enemies grudgingly admire him. And he had charisma, real charisma, the kind that makes ordinary men believe they can do extraordinary things simply by being near the person who possesses it. Under Napoleon, France did not simply fight wars. It transformed the very nature of warfare. The revolutionary armies had already introduced the concept of the citizen soldier, the idea that military service was not just the profession of a paid mercenary, but the duty of a free man defending his nation. Napoleon took this idea and organized it, disciplined it, equipped it, and pointed it at Europe with a precision that was devastating. His armies moved faster than anyone had thought armies could move. They lived off the land in a way that freed them from the long supply lines that slowed conventional forces. They were organized into self-contained corps that could operate independently and then concentrate rapidly at the point of decision. And they were led by a generation of commanders, Ney, Devout, Soult, Massena, who had learned their trade in the merciless school of revolutionary warfare and were, collectively, among the most capable military minds that any single nation had ever produced at one time. The result was a period of French military dominance unlike anything Europe had seen since perhaps the Romans. In the years between 1805 and 1809, Napoleon defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia in succession, sometimes within weeks, sometimes with campaigns so brilliantly conceived that they are still studied in military academies 2 centuries later. The Battle of Austerlitz, the Battle of Jena, the Battle of Wagram. Each one a demonstration of what was possible when military genius, national energy, and institutional innovation all arrived at the same place at the same time. Britain was different. Britain was an island, and its navy, under commanders like Nelson, had proven at Trafalgar in 1805 that France could not cross the Channel without being destroyed at sea. So Napoleon tried other approaches. He attempted to strangle the British economy through a commercial blockade of Europe. He married into the Austrian royal family to legitimize his dynasty. He placed his brothers on the thrones of various European kingdoms. And he fought a long, grinding, ultimately disastrous campaign in Spain and Portugal, the Peninsular War, that consumed French resources and French lives for 6 years without ever fully resolving. The 1st Regiment of Foot Guards was deeply involved in the Peninsular War. They fought at Salamanca, at Vitoria, at Bayonne. They marched hundreds of miles through terrain that was alternately baking hot and bitterly cold, through a country where the civilian population was both ally and potential threat, in a conflict that mixed conventional battlefield engagements with guerrilla warfare in ways that tested every assumption about how war was supposed to be fought. The Duke of Wellington commanded the British forces in the peninsula, and his relationship with the Guards and with his army in general was complex. He did not sentimentalize his soldiers. He was famously unsentimental about almost everything. But he trusted the Guards. He trusted them to hold positions that other units might abandon. He trusted their discipline. And discipline in Wellington's military philosophy was not a luxury. It was the foundation of everything. By the time Napoleon abdicated in 1814, forced from power by a coalition of European nations that had finally, after 2 decades of war and enormous loss, managed to coordinate their efforts sufficiently to trap him. The 1st Regiment of Foot Guards had become something more than a very good infantry regiment. They had become veterans in the deepest sense of the word. Men who had seen what sustained military pressure could do to an army, who had experienced the peculiar combination of boredom and terror that defines prolonged campaigning, who had watched good men die from enemy fire and bad water and disease, and cold in roughly equal measure, and who had come out of all of it still willing to stand in formation and fight. Napoleon went into exile on the island of Elba. Europe breathed. The peace, after so many years of war, felt almost strange. The Congress of Vienna met to redraw the map of Europe and decide what the post-Napoleonic world would look like. Diplomats who had spent years scrambling to survive now sat in comfortable rooms and argued about borders and dynasties and the balance of power. And then Napoleon escaped. He landed in the south of France in March of 1815 with a small force and began marching north. The French army, which was supposed to stop him, instead joined him. The king fled. Within weeks, Napoleon was back in Paris, back in power, facing a Europe that was once again uniting against him but had not yet fully organized itself to do so. He had, at most, a few months before the coalition armies would converge on France from every direction. He needed to strike fast. He needed to defeat the 2 armies that were already positioned in Belgium, Wellington's Anglo-Allied force and a Prussian army under Blücher, before they could combine their strength. The men of the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards received their orders and began moving toward Belgium. They had fought for years. They had earned their rest. They were not going to get it, because in a muddy field south of a small town called Waterloo, history was waiting for them. And history, it turned out, was going to say their name in a way that would last forever. They marched. They packed their equipment. They checked their muskets and their bayonets and their ammunition. They wrote letters home that many of them suspected might be the last letters they would ever write. And they moved north into Belgium, toward whatever was coming, carrying with them the full weight of everything they had been trained to be, everything they had experienced, everything that over a century and a half of service had made them. They were the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards. They did not yet know what they would be called after the battle ahead. They were about to find out. The morning of the 18th of June, 1815, arrived gray and wet. It had rained the night before, not a gentle summer shower, but a sustained, heavy downpour that turned the fields of Belgium into something approaching swamp. The earth was saturated. Men who had tried to sleep on the ground had woken up cold, damp, and stiff. Horses had struggled to find footing on the muddy slopes. The artillery, the heavy guns that both sides depended on, was almost impossible to move through ground that soft. Wheels sank. Horses strained. Men pushed from behind with their shoulders and their last reserves of strength. Napoleon was grateful for the mud, in one respect. It forced him to delay his attack. He needed the ground to firm up before his artillery could be positioned effectively. So the French army waited, breakfasted, and watched the sun make its slow, weak effort to burn through the overcast sky. Across the valley, on the long ridge that Wellington had selected with characteristic care as his defensive position, the Anglo-Allied army did the same. They ate what food they had. They checked their equipment. They tried not to think too hard about what the day was going to bring. Wellington had chosen his ground with the precision of a man who had spent decades thinking about the relationship between terrain and tactical outcome. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean gave his infantry something to shelter behind. They could lie on the reverse slope, out of direct cannon fire, while their opponents advanced uphill into musket range. In front of the ridge, slightly forward of the main line, was a complex of buildings that would become one of the most fought-over pieces of ground in military history. A farmhouse, an orchard, a garden, a barn, surrounded by walls of varying height and connected by narrow gates. The place was called Hougoumont. Wellington looked at it and understood immediately what it was: a fortress in miniature. A position that, if held, would anchor his right flank and force any French attack on that side to go around it or through it. Either option would cost the French dearly. He assigned guards to it. Among them were men of the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards. The fighting at Hougoumont began before the main battle had fully started. French infantry, thousands of them, moved against the complex with orders to take it and open the Allied right flank. What followed was one of the most brutal small unit engagements in the entire Napoleonic period. The guards defending Hougoumont were outnumbered. They were surrounded on multiple sides. They fought from behind walls, through loopholes cut in stone, across courtyards that filled with bodies so quickly that men were stepping over the fallen to reach new firing positions. The French came again and again. They brought ladders to scale the walls. They set fire to parts of the buildings. At one point, a group of French soldiers led by a giant of a man named Sous-Lieutenant Legros, who had been given the nickname L'Enfonceur, the breaker, because of his habit of using an axe to smash through obstacles, broke through the large north gate of Hougoumont and poured inside the courtyard. For a few seconds, it appeared that the position might fall, that the gate was lost, that the carefully planned defense of the Allied right flank was about to collapse. What happened next was instantaneous and decisive. A small group of guards, some accounts say as few as 30 to 40 men, saw the gate breached and responded not by retreating but by charging toward it. They fought through the French soldiers who had entered the courtyard, pushing them back through the gate through sheer close-quarters violence. And then, with the French partially outside and partially inside, the guards managed something almost impossible under those conditions. They got the gate shut. They pushed it closed against the bodies of men still trying to force it open and dropped the bar across it. The French soldiers who had made it inside the courtyard were isolated. They were killed almost to a man. The only one spared, according to accounts from survivors, was a young drummer boy, a child, who was found among the dead and wounded and allowed to live. Wellington, watching from the ridge above, later said that the defense of Hougoumont was the thing that saved him at Waterloo. He was not exaggerating for effect. The French had committed far more men to taking Hougoumont than they had originally intended, drawn in by the stubborn resistance of the guards and the Allied soldiers fighting alongside them. Men and resources that Napoleon had planned to use elsewhere were being swallowed by this farmhouse, this orchard, this garden that refused to fall. The burning buildings sent smoke across the battlefield. The noise of the fighting at Hougoumont never stopped from the moment it began until the battle was over, and through all of it, the guards held. But this was only one part of what the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards had to face that day. The main French attack came in the early afternoon. Napoleon massed his artillery, over 200 guns, and opened what became known as La Grande Battery. The bombardment was unlike anything most soldiers on either side had experienced. The sound alone was described by survivors as something that went beyond hearing, something felt in the chest and the stomach, something that seemed to press the air out of the lungs. The ground shook. Mud and grass and pieces of equipment and pieces of men were thrown into the air. Horses screamed in a register that was almost human. Officers who had fought in the peninsula, who had thought they understood what cannon fire was, found themselves struggling with the simple task of remaining standing. Wellington's infantry on the ridge behind him were largely sheltered by the reverse slope, but not entirely. Cannonballs that went long found them lying in the wet grass, Round-shot, solid iron spheres weighing several kilograms, traveling at velocities that the human mind cannot really process, hit the ground and bounced, skipping along the earth in a way that was oddly hypnotic right up until it took a man's legs off. Men learned very quickly not to try to dodge individual cannonballs. The gap between seeing one and being hit by it was too small for conscious reaction. You either were hit or you weren't. There was no useful middle ground. After the bombardment came the infantry. French columns, dense formations of men marching shoulder to shoulder in a way that was designed to generate momentum and mass, moved across the valley and up the slope toward the Allied line. The theory behind the column attack was straightforward. A column was psychologically intimidating in a way that a line was not. Thousands of men moving together, drums beating, voices shouting the emperor's name, bayonets fixed. It was a wall of human will and metal bearing down on whatever stood in its way. The French had used this formation to break armies across Europe for 15 years. Wellington's response was the line. Two ranks of infantry standing parallel, every man in the line able to bring his musket to bear on the advancing column. The mathematics were simple and devastating. A column of French infantry, however large, could only bring the men in its front ranks to fire at any given moment. The men behind them were marching, not shooting. A British line, by contrast, brought every musket in the formation to bear simultaneously. The volume of fire from a disciplined British line meeting a French column at close range was something that the French commanders understood in theory, but continued to underestimate in practice, again and again, because the column attack had worked so many times before, and because there was something about the sight of thousands of men moving toward you that made it feel, viscerally, like the column had to win. It did not win, not against the Guards. The Guards lay behind the ridge as the French columns approached, listening to the sound of thousands of boots on wet grass, waiting for the order. They could not see the French yet. They could hear the drums. They could hear the shouting. And then Wellington's order came, stand up, and they rose from the ground, stepped forward to the crest of the ridge, and looked down at what was coming toward them. The French column was enormous. The Guards were in line. They raised their muskets, and at a range close enough to see the faces of the men on the other side, they fired. The effect of disciplined volley fire at close range into a dense formation is something that defies the kind of language usually used to describe military engagements. It was not heroic. It was not like anything depicted in paintings of the period, with their rearing horses and dramatic postures. It was industrial, it was systematic, and it was devastating. The front ranks of the French column simply ceased to exist as a formed body of men. The column, which had been moving forward with all the momentum of a wave, slammed into a wall of lead and stopped. And in the seconds while the French were still processing what had happened, still trying to reorganize, still tangled in the chaos of men falling and men behind pressing forward and officers screaming orders, in those seconds, the Guards reloaded and fired again. Wellington ordered a counterattack. The Guards moved down the slope with bayonets fixed, pushing into the confused mass of the French column. The French broke, not everywhere at once. Not all of them. There were individual French officers and soldiers who fought with extraordinary courage and died in place rather than retreat. But the column as a formation collapsed. Men ran. Officers tried to stop them and were ignored. The Guards pursued to a certain distance, then reformed, because they were disciplined enough to know that pursuit without control was its own form of disaster. This scene repeated itself across the afternoon with variations. French cavalry, the heavy armored cuirassiers and the dramatic, plumed hussars, attacked the Allied line in massive charges that were genuinely terrifying to watch and face. The Guards formed squares, the defensive formation that turned an infantry unit into a four-sided box of bayonets impossible for cavalry to break from the outside. Inside the square, men pressed together, the outer ranks kneeling with bayonets angled outward, the inner ranks firing over their shoulders at the horsemen circling around them. Being inside a square under cavalry attack was a particular kind of nightmare, surrounded on all sides, deafened by the sound of hooves and screaming horses and musketry, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction, entirely dependent on the discipline of the men beside you to hold the formation that was the only thing keeping everyone alive. The guards held their squares. The cavalry broke around them like water around stone. Napoleon, watching from a position he had selected on a slight rise to the south, could see that the battle was not going the way he needed it to go. His attacks had been repulsed. His cavalry had exhausted itself against the Allied squares. Hougoumont was still not taken, and in the east, something was appearing on the horizon that Napoleon had known might happen but had hoped his subordinate Grouchy could prevent. Prussian troops. The army of Blücher, which Napoleon had thought was beaten and retreating after the Battle of Ligny 2 days earlier, was not retreating. It was marching toward Waterloo, and it was going to arrive on the French right flank while the French army was already engaged. Napoleon had one card left to play. He had kept them in reserve all day, which in itself was a statement about their importance. They were the Imperial Guard, his personal guard, the elite of the French army, the veterans who had served with him from the beginning, who had been in Egypt and Italy and Austerlitz and Wagram. They had never been broken in battle. Their mere appearance on a battlefield was intended to be decisive. The moment when Napoleon committed his ultimate reserve was supposed to be the moment when the battle ended. When they marched, other units that were wavering found their courage again. When they appeared at the front, it was a signal that the Emperor himself had decided the moment had come. Napoleon sent them in against the Allied line in the late afternoon as the sounds of Prussian artillery began to be heard on the right. The Imperial Guard advanced in columns, as French infantry always advanced, but their columns were smaller and more maneuverable than the earlier attacks. They moved up the slope with extraordinary steadiness. Officers fell. Men fell. They closed up the gaps and kept moving. This was what they were. This was what they had been built to do. They crested the ridge, and they found the guards waiting. What happened in the next few minutes at the top of that ridge is one of the most analyzed and argued over tactical engagements in military history. The numbers vary in different accounts. The exact positions are disputed. Individual officers claimed credit for decisions that other officers also claimed credit for. But the essential shape of what happened is agreed upon. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's finest, his reserve, the men who were supposed to end the battle, met the disciplined fire of the British Guards and the other Allied infantry at the crest of the ridge, took casualties that their formation could not absorb, wavered and broke. The Imperial Guard had never broken before. This was known on both sides. When the word spread through the French army, the Guard retreats, the Guard retreats, it did something to the psychology of the entire French force that no amount of rational calculation could have predicted or prevented. If the Guard could break, anything could break. If the men who had never run were running, there was no reason to stay. The French army, which had been fighting hard and well all day despite significant losses, simply came apart. Units that had been holding their positions began to move. The movement became flow. The flow became a rout. Wellington, watching from horseback as the French collapsed across the field, removed his hat and waved it toward the French lines, toward the enemy, toward the setting sun. It was the signal for a general advance. The Allied army came off the ridge and moved forward, and the Battle of Waterloo, which had lasted from mid-morning to early evening and had cost both sides tens of thousands of men killed and wounded, ended in the collapse of the greatest army that France had ever put in the field. The 1st Regiment of Foot Guards had fought at Hougoumont and on the ridge. They had fired their muskets until the barrels were hot to the touch. They had fixed bayonets and charged down a muddy slope into a mass of men who outnumbered them. They had stood in squares while horsemen screamed around them in tight, terrible circles. They had received the Imperial Guard at the crest of the ridge and had not given way. They had done, in a single day, what they had been trained to do across a century and a half of service. As darkness came down over the battlefield and the Prussian cavalry pursued the broken French army across the night fields of Belgium, the men of the regiment found themselves surrounded by the wreckage of what had happened. The ground was covered with the dead and wounded of both armies. The noise of the battle had been replaced by something quieter and in many ways worse. The sounds of suffering, of men calling for water, of horses that could not be helped. Officers moved through the darkness with lanterns, accounting for their men, trying to understand who was missing and what that meant. The guards had taken significant casualties. The numbers would be counted later, when the light came back and the living could walk the ground and read the full extent of what the day had cost. Some companies had lost more than a third of their men. Officers who had come through the peninsula, who had survived years of campaigning, had died in the space of a few hours on this slope outside a small Belgian village. But they had held. They had held when the French came against Hougoumont. They had held when the columns attacked the ridge. They had held in their squares against the cavalry. And they had held at the end when Napoleon sent his most precious military asset against them and asked the question that the whole of Europe had been asking for 20 years. Is there anything that can stand up to France at its absolute best? The answer, given on a muddy ridge in Belgium on an overcast June evening, was yes. There was. The morning after the battle was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily strange experience. The battlefield was enormous, stretching across several square miles of farmland and forest. It was covered in the debris of tens of thousands of men and horses. The smell alone was something that survivors mentioned for the rest of their lives. People came from Brussels and the surrounding villages to look, some out of morbid curiosity, some hopping to find missing relatives, some simply because they could not quite believe what had happened and needed to see it to understand. Surgeons worked through the night and into the morning. The wounded who could walk or be carried had already been moved. Those who couldn't were still on the field, waiting. Officers sent men to find their fallen comrades, to give them whatever help was still possible, to recover personal effects that might be sent home to families who did not yet know what had happened. Wellington himself wrote his dispatch to London, the official account of the battle, sitting in a house in Waterloo that evening. He was exhausted and deeply shaken. He had lost friends. He had made decisions that had cost men their lives. He had commanded a battle of extraordinary complexity and won it, but winning it did not feel the way he had imagined it might. He famously said afterward that nothing was so melancholy as a battle won except a battle lost. The line captures something real about the experience of command at that level, the gap between the strategic necessity of winning and the personal cost of what winning required. The regiment would count its dead and wounded. It would receive the thanks of a grateful nation. Expressed in the particular formal language of royal proclamations and parliamentary resolutions, it would march back through Brussels and eventually back to Britain. And when the question of what to call them was considered, how to mark what they had done, how to distinguish the regiment that had played a central role in the defeat of Napoleon's finest soldiers at the decisive battle of a generation, the answer that was chosen was simple and permanent. They would be named for the battle. They would carry it with them forever. From that point forward, they would not simply be the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards. They would be the Grenadier Guards, named in recognition of their defeat of the French Grenadiers of the Imperial Guard, the most elite soldiers in the most powerful army in Europe, at the Battle of Waterloo. The name was not a decoration. It was a record, a permanent public statement carved into the identity of the regiment that said, these men were there, they faced the best, and the best did not break them. They had earned something that cannot be awarded, something that cannot be manufactured or purchased or given by any authority, however powerful. They had earned a story, and the story was true. The world that the Grenadier Guards returned to after Waterloo was a fundamentally different world from the one in which they had grown up as soldiers. For 20 years, Europe had been at war. An entire generation had come of age knowing nothing but conflict, knowing that young men went away to fight, and some of them came back and some of them didn't, knowing that the borders of countries changed with the outcomes of battles, knowing that the person sitting on a throne in Paris or Madrid or Naples might be someone completely different in 5 years because of what happened on a particular morning in a particular field. That world was over. Napoleon was gone, this time to St. Helena, a small island in the South Atlantic so remote that there was genuinely no realistic possibility of escape. The wars of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic period were finished. What replaced them was something that historians have called the Concert of Europe, a system of diplomatic cooperation between the great powers, designed to prevent any single nation from achieving the kind of dominance that France had briefly held. The major powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and eventually France itself, would consult and coordinate and manage the affairs of the continent collectively, dampening conflicts before they became catastrophes, maintaining the balance of power through negotiation rather than constant warfare. It was imperfect, as all human systems are imperfect. It would eventually fail, as all human systems eventually fail. But for a generation, it worked well enough to give Europe something it had not had for a very long time: peace. For the Grenadier Guards, peace brought its own particular set of challenges. War is terrible, but it is clarifying in a way that peace is not. In wartime, the purpose of a soldier is obvious. The training that seemed repetitive and arbitrary in peacetime reveals its logic when the moment comes to use it. The hierarchy that seemed rigid and impersonal turns out to be the thing that keeps people alive when everything else is chaos. But in peacetime, a soldier must maintain all of that discipline, all of that readiness, all of that institutional structure, without any immediate and obvious reason to do so. The enemy is not coming today. The crisis is not happening this week. The skills that have been honed at such great cost have no immediate outlet. The temptation to let things slip, to relax the standards, to allow the sharp edge of the regiment to dull slightly, because there is no visible need for it to be sharp. That temptation is real, and resisting it requires a different kind of discipline than the kind required on a battlefield. The Grenadier Guards were given new responsibilities in peacetime that shaped what they would become over the following 2 centuries. They became the regiment most closely associated with the formal protection and ceremonial representation of the monarchy. This was not entirely new. The Guards had always had a royal protection function, going back to their founding under Charles II. But in the post-Waterloo world, as Britain became the dominant global power, and London became the undisputed center of the most extensive empire the world had ever seen, the ceremonial role of the Guards became something different. It became visible in a way it had never quite been before. It became something that the world watched. The changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace, that 45-minute ceremony of precise movement and military music that has drawn crowds of tourists for well over a century, is in many ways a product of this post-Waterloo period, when the Guards settled into a permanent presence at the royal residences and developed the ceremonial traditions that would become the public face of British military culture. The bearskin cap that the Guards wear, that enormous black cylinder of fur that adds a foot to the height of any man wearing it, has its own story connected to Waterloo. The bearskin had been the distinctive headgear of the French Imperial Guards Grenadier companies. After Waterloo, the British Guards adopted it. There are different accounts of exactly when and why this became formalized, but the symbolic logic is straightforward. They had defeated the men who wore it. They had the right to wear it themselves. The 19th century carried the regiment into a series of conflicts that bore almost no resemblance to the large-scale European warfare of the Napoleonic period. The British Empire expanded dramatically in the decades after Waterloo, and with expansion came the constant, grinding necessity of maintaining that expansion against resistance. The Crimean War of the 1850s sent the Guards to the Black Sea to fight alongside France, now an ally rather than an enemy, a shift that would have seemed almost impossible to the men who had faced French columns on the ridge at Waterloo against Russia. The conditions in the Crimea were appalling. Disease killed more men than combat. The logistics of supplying an army at that distance from home were managed with spectacular incompetence that resulted in soldiers dying of preventable causes, while adequate supplies sat undelivered in ports. The charge of the Light Brigade happened in the Crimea, and it became famous partly because of how much it represented the chaos and mismanagement that characterized much of the campaign. The Guards served in the Crimea with the same steadiness that had characterized their service in previous conflicts, which is to say that they endured conditions that were objectively terrible and did not break. They took their casualties. They maintained their discipline. They held the positions they were given. But the Crimean War left a deep mark on the British public's understanding of military service and military management. And the reforms that followed, improvements in medical care, logistics, officer education, the administrative infrastructure of the army, shaped the institution that the Guards were part of for the rest of the century. Egypt, Sudan, South Africa. The Boer War at the turn of the 20th century, which was unlike any conflict the Guards had previously faced. A war against an enemy that refused to stand in formations and fight in the conventional manner, that used the terrain with extraordinary skill, that employed ambush and mobility and irregular tactics that made the disciplined line infantry somewhat less relevant than it had been in the Napoleonic era. The Boer War forced the British Army to confront the ways in which 19th century assumptions about how war was fought were becoming obsolete. And it was the beginning of a rethinking that would accelerate dramatically when the 20th century arrived. The 20th century was, among other things, the era in which the Grenadier Guards earned another layer of the story that had started at Waterloo. The First World War began in the summer of 1914 and almost immediately became something that no one on either side had anticipated. The war of rapid movement that military planners had imagined, a short, decisive conflict settled in weeks by the collision of large professional armies, became instead a 4-year nightmare of attrition, trench warfare, artillery bombardments that made La Grande Battery at Waterloo look modest, and casualties on a scale that the 19th century had simply not prepared anyone to imagine. The Grenadier Guards deployed to France and Belgium in the autumn of 1914. They found themselves in a landscape that was familiar in geography. Parts of it were only miles from the Waterloo battlefield, which must have seemed bitterly ironic and utterly unrecognizable in nature. The trenches, the mud, the constant artillery, the gas attacks that arrived without warning and killed or maimed men in ways that seemed designed specifically to maximize suffering. None of this resembled anything in the regimental history. But the things that the regiment had always been good at: discipline under pressure, unit cohesion, the ability to hold a position when everything around it was collapsing, remained relevant even in this utterly transformed context. The Guards fought at the Battle of Loos in 1915. They fought on the Somme in 1916, in conditions that exceeded even the grimness of the rest of that terrible battle. They fought at Passchendaele, in mud that was worse than anything Belgium had offered before, in an environment so comprehensively destroyed by artillery fire that the landscape resembled nothing so much as the surface of the moon after a rainstorm. Officers who had grown up reading about Waterloo and the peninsula found themselves commanding men through assaults on positions that were perhaps 50 yards away, assaults that cost hundreds of lives for gains measured in feet. The tactical framework of the Napoleonic era had nothing useful to say about this. What remained constant was the willingness of the regiment to show up, to absorb casualties, to maintain cohesion, to continue functioning as a unit when other units fragmented. The The losses of the First World War scarred every institution in British society, and the Grenadier Guards were not exempt. The regiment lost thousands of men. Entire cohorts of officers who would have led the regiment in the following generation were killed in France and Belgium. The names on the memorials in regimental chapels from this period fill pages, and yet the institution survived, rebuilt, incorporated new men, trained them, passed on to them the things that made a guardsman, the standards, the traditions, the particular combination of pride and discipline and absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible, and emerged from the war still recognizable as itself. The Second World War brought different challenges. The Guards fought in North Africa, in Italy, in the liberation of Northwest Europe from 1944 onward. The Guard Armored Division, Guards regiments that had converted to tanks, which would have astonished the men who had fixed bayonets at Waterloo, fought through France, Belgium, and into Germany. They were in the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden. They crossed the Rhine. They were part of the Allied force that entered Germany in the spring of 1945 and brought to an end the worst war in human history. Through all of this, through the Crimea and Egypt and South Africa and 2 world wars and the various colonial campaigns and policing actions and peacekeeping deployments that followed, the regiment never stopped being what it had always been. It adapted its weapons, its tactics, its equipment. It confronted new forms of warfare, new enemies, new environments. It sent its soldiers to Northern Ireland during the Troubles, to the Falkland Islands in 1982, to the Gulf, to Bosnia, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, all of the places where Britain's military commitments took it in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But at the same time, in a different register, operating in a different key, the regiment maintained the ceremonial traditions that had made it the most recognizable military unit in the world to people who would never see it in a combat zone. The changing of the Guard continued. The bearskin caps continued. The scarlet tunics continued. The precise, unhurried, perfectly coordinated movements at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle and the Tower of London continued. And the tourists continued to come from every country in the world, speaking every language, standing behind barriers with cameras and phones, watching something that their own countries did not have and perhaps could not manufacture even if they wanted to. What those tourists were watching, though many of them did not know it, was not simply a performance. It was not, despite what cynics sometimes suggest, an exercise in nostalgia or an attempt to make the past seem quaint and charming. What they were watching was the living end of a thread that went back through 2 world wars and the Boer War and the Crimea, and Egypt and the Peninsula, and all the way to a farmhouse called Hougoumont, and a ridge outside a village called Waterloo, where men in these same tunics carrying these same regimental standards held a position that they were not supposed to be able to hold and defeated soldiers who had never been defeated before. The bearskin cap that a Grenadier Guard wears today when he stands outside Buckingham Palace in the summer rain, staring straight ahead, ignoring the cameras and the crowds and the occasional tourist who stands directly in front of him trying to make him flinch. That cap was taken symbolically from the French Imperial Guard at Waterloo. It is a trophy that has been worn every day for over 200 years. It weighs approximately 1.5 pounds and gets very warm in summer and very cold in winter. It is not particularly comfortable, but it is worn correctly, and it is worn with the understanding of what it represents, which is something that every guardsman learns in training and carries with him for the rest of his life. The regiment's motto is Honi soit qui mal y pense, a French phrase, which is one of the small ironies of British history, meaning roughly shame on him who thinks evil of it. It is the motto of the Order of the Garter, the oldest and most senior order of chivalry in Britain, and its presence in the regimental identity reflects the long intertwining of the Guards with the institution of monarchy itself. But overlaying that ancient motto is the battle honor that was added after Waterloo and has never been removed: Waterloo. It appears on the regimental colors. It appears in the regimental chapel. It appears in the histories and the traditions and the ceremonies that mark the regiment's year. It is always there. The 18th of June is still observed by the regiment. The anniversary of the battle is not forgotten or treated as ancient history. It is remembered the way a family remembers the thing that made it what it is, not as a museum exhibit but as a living fact, something that happened to real people who were the direct predecessors of the people observing the anniversary today. The continuity is institutional rather than biological, but it is real. A Grenadier Guard in 2015, the 200th anniversary of the battle, standing at Waterloo for the commemoration, wearing the uniform of the regiment, was connected to the men who had stood on that same ground in 1815 through a chain of training and tradition and institutional memory that had never broken. What does it mean to carry a name like that? What does it mean to wear a uniform that says, in effect, we were there, we did that, that is who we are? It means something different in every period of history, and the meaning shifts depending on what the regiment is being asked to do in any given moment. During the First World War, it was perhaps a source of pressure, the expectation that the Guards would perform at a level consistent with their reputation, even in conditions that made consistent performance almost impossibly costly. During quieter periods, it might have been more like a weight, a set of standards to be maintained, traditions to be upheld, an identity to be lived up to even when the living was routine and unheroic, and involved more paperwork than adventure. But it also means something simpler and more durable than any of that. It means that there is a story, a true story, verifiable in historical records, witnessed by thousands of people on both sides, documented in dispatches and memoirs and letters home. A story about a morning that began gray and wet, and a battle that was long and terrible, and a moment at the end of the afternoon when the most elite soldiers in Europe came up a slope and found men in scarlet tunics waiting for them with muskets and discipline, and the particular kind of courage that is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. That story does not change. It happened. It is true. And every guardsman who puts on the uniform, whether he is a 19-year-old recruit doing his first ceremonial duty outside the palace, or a veteran sergeant who has served in 3 combat zones and been decorated twice, is wearing that story on his back. He may not think about it every day. He may not consciously feel the weight of 200 years of regimental history every time he puts on the bearskin, but it is there. The institution he belongs to was shaped by it. The traditions he follows grew from it. The name he carries was given for it. There is a practical reason why militaries maintain ceremonial traditions that might seem, to an outside observer, like expensive theater. Ceremony does something to the people who perform it, and the people who witness it that purely functional activity cannot do. It creates a sense of continuity. It makes visible the connection between the present and the past. It says, in the particular language of ritual and symbol, that what was done by the people who came before you was worth doing, worth remembering, worth maintaining the thread of. It creates identity in a way that regulations and training programs alone cannot create. A soldier who knows the story of his regiment, who has internalized not just its rules but its history, is a different kind of soldier from one who has only learned the technical requirements of the job. He has something to be, not just something to do. The Grenadier Guards today are a regiment of the British Army that deploys operationally like any other infantry unit. Their soldiers train with the same weapons, use the same equipment, attend the same courses, earn the same qualifications as any other infantry in the British military. There is nothing ceremonially anachronistic about their combat capability. When a Guards battalion goes to a war zone, it goes to fight, not to perform. But they also stand outside Buckingham Palace in the rain with bearskin caps and scarlet tunics. They guard Windsor Castle. They provide the Queen's Guard and the King's Guard and the Tower Guard. They perform ceremonies that have been performed in largely the same form for generations, in a city that has changed enormously around them, while these particular rituals have remained stable. And when people ask why maintain traditions that seem so far removed from the realities of modern warfare? Why dress in a way that no one else in the modern world dresses? Why perform rituals whose origins are centuries old in a 21st century that has largely abandoned the past as a source of guidance? The answer is not sentimentality. The answer is not stubbornness or aristocratic nostalgia or an inability to move on from the Victorian era. The answer is Waterloo. It is the understanding that the identity of the regiment, the thing that makes it what it is and not something else, was built over a very long time through the accumulation of experiences that were genuinely extraordinary. That the story of the Guards is a real story, with real people and real stakes and real consequences. That the ceremonies and traditions are not decorations on top of that story, but expressions of it, ways of keeping the story present, of insisting that it matters, of refusing to let it become merely a historical curiosity that schoolchildren read about and then forget. On any given day in London, if you stand outside Buckingham Palace at the right time, you will see them. Tall men, the minimum height requirement for the Guards, has a long history, in bearskin caps and scarlet tunics, moving with the kind of precision that requires months of drilling to achieve and years of maintenance to sustain. They will not speak to you. They will not acknowledge your presence, your camera, or your attempts to make them react. They will stand or march with an absolute stillness of expression that is, when you understand what it represents, rather more impressive than it might first appear. Because what you are looking at is not a performance for your entertainment. What you are looking at is a regiment, a real regiment with 200 years of continuous history, with battle honors earned in places where the cost of earning them was measured in lives, with a name given on the evening of the 18th of June, 1815, when the sun went down over a field in Belgium, and the French Imperial Guard broke and ran, and Europe understood that something had changed forever. They are the Grenadier Guards. They were named for what they did. They have spent over 2 centuries being worthy of the name. That is the whole story, and it is true.